Heavenly Father, as we gather today for this training session, we thank you for the opportunity to learn and grow. Guide our minds and hearts with your wisdom, allowing us to absorb the information presented with openness and diligence. Grant us focus, patience, and the ability to ask thoughtful questions. May the knowledge gained here be used to serve others and bring positive change. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
One nation under God, indivisible, and with honor the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to the Texas, one state under God, one nation. All right, if we have the roll call, please.
Yes, sir. Kevin Kushnick.
Here.
Devin Bachman. Susie Selwyn. Here. Ed Bennett.
Here.
Caitlin Shue. John Cudd. Deanne Heberlin. Gabriel Hippel. James McGill. Ramiro Canales. Leticia Roberts. Melissa Vela. And Terry Nowak. We have a quorum, sir.
Thank you. Call this meeting to order. The meeting of the Board of Directors, Nueces County Appraisal District will be called to order, and let the record show we have a quorum of board members that are present, that this meeting has been duly called, and the notice has been posted in accordance with the Texas Open Meetings Act, Government Code 551, and that any conflict of interest affidavits have been received and placed on file as required by law. Do we have any public comment?
No, sir.
All right, no public comment?
No.
And item number 6, we'll go on to our workshop. I'm happy to introduce Joe Longoria. He's partner with Purdue, Brandon Fielder, Collins, and Mott, LLP, out of the Houston office. And we thank you for coming.
Well, good morning. Thank you for the invitation. As the chairman explained, my name is Joe Longoria. I'm a partner in law firm at Purdue, Brandon Fielder, Collins, and Mott. We've been in practice for 50-plus years. I've been practicing since last century when the tax code was this wide, and now the tax code's gotten fairly complicated. So I am pleased and honored to be here to make this presentation. If you bear with me at the second one, make sure he gets the right
Certainly.
PowerPoint.
And let the record show that James McGill has joined us.
Good morning.
So I'll do it the old-fashioned way, say slide, right?
Mhm.
If we want to wait for another 2 minutes, I can go around the back track
Can Jackie bring it in? Does she know?
This is the wonders of technology. I just used to hand out paper, and we'd already be halfway through it. But what I would like to hand out to everybody is some attendance gifts, because you deserve a reward, really, for showing up for this exciting and scintillating training seminar. It's just a calendar, and what I have included in there is, I know we have some new board members, in particular elected board members. It's just a Texas primer. So I'd rather a primer on Texas property tax law, and I've attributed it, I got it off the wonderful wide world of the internet. It is a very, very succinct but very accurate representation of the state of the Texas property tax system. And Chief Professor Canales, I'm sorry I didn't acknowledge you. It's good to see you again. I've seen you at the TAAD conferences. Good to see you. Normally what I do in these training seminars is we do the top 10 things that chief appraisers and board members should be most aware of, and in the real world and in the perfect world, actively practice. I know that's not how appraisal districts operate on a day-to-day basis, so if anybody has any questions about any topic that I bring up or any general question, please feel free to interrupt me and I will do my best to answer this. While he's setting up this wonderful PowerPoint, let me give you some of the background of the property tax system. In my view of what board of directors do and what their most important functions are. First of all, the appraisal district has consistently always been the face of the property tax system in Texas. And why do I say that? Because in the summertime, you get tens of thousands of people pouring in the door, sometimes for good reasons, but mostly for bad reasons, complaining about the property tax, the assessment, how many taxes they have to pay. But generally speaking, an appraisal district's function is completely separate from the collection function. And that is because back in 1979, Wayne Pivotal promulgated what's known as the Pivotal Bill. And that was to address the many, many problems that the appraisal district, that the tax system had in Texas. Before 1982, every assessor collector, every taxing unit in the county had their own, they appraised their own property. They set their own value on the property. They set their own tax rate on the property. So what's the problem with that? The county would set the value on this building, call it $1 million. The city would set the value on this building. They think it's worth $2 million. School district would set the value on this property. They think it's worth $500,000. So you would have a number of just totally crazy valuations from different entities, all at the same time, all of them vying for the same tax dollars. What the Pivotal Bill did was to eliminate that. You used to have to go to a board of equalization, which is similar to what the appraisal review board is now, except you would go to county commissioners and they would equalize your values. There was no real way to protest that in court other than if you didn't like it, you had to file what's known as an injunction. That is an extraordinary remedy, and to enjoin the issuance of the tax roll was very, very rarely granted. So it was very unfriendly to taxpayers. Pivotal Bill did away with all of that. The main thrust of the Pivotal Bill was to separate the functions of appraisal by creating the Central Appraisal District, where we all are sitting right now. Separated that function from the assessment function. Some appraisal districts do collect, but they still have separate functions. They are constitutionally separate. An appraisal district cannot come in and set the tax rate. They cannot come in and assess and collect it unless there's an interlocal contract of some kind. But the bill was passed, and it was completely new. When it started off as a small binding that was about this thick, has now turned into this. This is, and in the slides, if we ever get it up, we'll see the original tax code, which I am lucky to have one. This is 600 plus pages of 8-inch type, 8-point type, double paged. The original tax code was probably about this thick, double spaced, nice big fat letters, 14-point letters that you could see all the time. It's expanded to what we have today, and it's because the taxpayers and the taxing entities have modified it to meet the times. And of course, we are in very, very different times now than we were even a couple of years ago. The biggest change, and we'll discuss that, is the elections in many, many jurisdictions in Texas. The large jurisdictions now elect 3 board members as a general election. How are we coming on that?
I'm going to open it in the browser-based
Okay.
point, so I'm getting this set up. I'm sorry, we weren't, I didn't realize we were going to have to just let it.
Well, as I said, the main points of what I would like to discuss is, and I'll go from memory here, is the first thing that I like to tell the appraisal district training members is y'all have as board members 2 very, very, very important functions. One, you hire, evaluate, fire, and hire and evaluate, hire, fire, and evaluate your chief appraiser. Y'all have authority over 2 employees. One is the chief appraiser, and the second one is the taxpayer liaison officer. Both of those individuals serve at y'all's pleasure. They are employed by you, they report directly to you. Both have statutory duties that have been modified significantly. The chief appraiser basically is find the property, appraise it, make sure it's appraised properly, comply with all the laws and statutes in the Texas tax code. Your liaison officer is once again hired and fired at y'all's pleasure process, and there's a vote, a motion process, and there's a vote, a motion, debate, vote. School is closed. There's an immediate impact on the constituents affected by that. That doesn't happen here with the appraisal districts. I used to describe appraisal districts as a benign board because they didn't have a whole bunch of authority directly on operations of the appraisal function. Most of that, I've changed my opinion now because I think boards can take a more active role in how property is managed, how the chief appraiser manages the appraisal district. But that's all budgetary in nature. That has not changed. Y'all's main function, y'all's main role in continuing the operation of this appraisal district is when you set your budget. The budget is what determines whether you have nice computers to operate for your property, for your staff members, and whether, more importantly, you have tools that allow your staff appraisers to go out and find and locate and appraise property. If you don't budget for things like that, then the appraisal function is definitely going to be affected. And it's not something that you can immediately reach out and measure, but you will certainly see that as time goes by. And I can tell y'all stories of appraisal districts who have decided to limit or not fund or not keep up with the quickly developing software that's available in our field. And they can't say, okay, well, we decided not to do the whiz-bang gizmo that allows them to find exemptions magically this year. There's no way they can see that they've missed a whole bunch of exemptions or have had errors in granting exemptions immediately. But over time, that's going to be noticeable when you go through the MAPS reviews by the state, or when you start to see, most importantly, value losses or errors brought to y'all's attention by the taxpayers. So the budgetary function is very, very important, and I think that's one of the things that, if we get this up, is it opening?
Just the computer's having trouble doing streaming and PowerPoint at the same time. I think we may be able to open it, but not actually stream it. Is that okay?
That's fine. If I can see that far.
We can put it on the TV.
Perfect.
It just won't show up in the YouTube feed.
That's fine. Sometimes I do miss the days of paper and pencil. There we go. Maybe. There. This is these are the training materials. The two individuals you see there is Chris Jackson is my law partner. He and I have been doing this for years. We kind of trade off. If he can't do it, we switch off doing training sessions. Robert Mott is the Mott of Purdue, Brandon, Fielder, Collins, and Mott. Mott is probably, he is the dean of property tax in the state of Texas. He was there when the pivotal bill was passed. He was present there. He actually worked for then Lieutenant Governor Bullock. And the story that Robert tells is that the day the bill passed, Lieutenant Governor Bullock came into a young attorney, Robert Mott, He said, here, this bill just passed, it's Senate Bill 621, and it was about that thick. Big. I have it on 14-inch paper. He says, I want that summarized by tomorrow morning at 7 in one page. And he turned around and did that, and he's been in the field since then. He's now of counsel to us, but he is a font of wisdom. The guy who's hired me, he was my mentor. Just next slide, please. History lesson, that's Wayne Pebido. Lives in Orange, Texas. He is 90-plus years old, still runs a cattle farm. Orange, Texas is Beaumont, Jefferson County. Quick, just to need to know nickel knowledge about property taxes. Property taxes back then after the revolution, for Texas independence, they were still doing what they do now, local and state government support. It was decentralized. You had some jurisdictions, to the extent they existed, had assessor collectors, some didn't, but there was no state input, not control, input, nothing at all with regard to that. After the Civil War, 2/3 of Texas counties had assessor collectors. The Great Depression, 20% of the statewide levy went delinquent, which is a massive shortcoming in funding. In the 1940s, imagine properties assessed at 45% of market value. If you think of market value, it's just market value, but your tax rates are applied to that market value to generate the taxes that operate this building, that pay for your police officers and pay for every type of government function and service out there. In the 50s and 70s, that's when they started to limit statewide property tax. And in 82, with the Pebido bill, that's when they eliminated statewide property tax. We do not have statewide property tax. It's all imposed locally, all collected locally, all managed locally, which is unique for the state of Texas. Next slide, please. This is just a short history right here. This is basically what Pebido bill did. Set constitution separation of appraisal and assessment, created the CADs, created a detailed administrative process for the taxpayer to protest. That's the ARB procedure. And then a very simple judicial review of taxpayer protests. We'll talk about that later, because that's probably the most visible thing for appraisal districts during the summer and fall, the number of lawsuits that they file. And on occasion, you might have one property owner or two property owners in a jurisdiction that eat up all the media time just because of either the high profile nature of the taxpayer or because of the amount of tax dollars that are at stake. I'm talking about refineries. Years ago, the refineries here and the refineries up in Houston, Galveston, and out in West Texas were at the forefront of the news, not because they were suing, but because they were in some instances suing and they constituted 25% of the tax base. So that was just a massive, massive risk of tax dollar lost. Next slide, please. There's the bill. That's my finger. That's the bill. That is actually the first copy of the Texas Property Tax Code. And you can see the difference now. You can see the difference. This thing weighs about 3 pounds. And that one is, it's not even 8.5 by 11, very, very small. And it's been modified and expanded to address direct taxpayer concerns and direct taxing unit concerns. Next slide, please. Qualifications, let's talk about qualifications. Now this applies to the board members, whether you are elected or whether you are appointed. And you'll hear me talk about elected and appointed throughout this process. Let me define it a little bit better. We have 3 board members, and I'm sorry, who are the elected members here? Welcome. You all had the joy and honor of going through a general election last year. I'll refer to these elected members as the electeds. The other 5 members are the appointed members, and they're basically appointed under the old statutory method. There are some appraisal districts, and I'm not sure if y'all were to this, who are operating under the 3/4 rule where the taxing units actually individually appointed board members.
We were at that point.
You were?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, you're one of the few. El Paso is also on that basis. Harris County also does that. So this is a totally new system for y'all. Now you're going to have 5 appointed members that are elected by the constituent taxing units and 3 appointed members who are elected by the general public in the county. Let's see the next slide. And these qualifications apply to either one of those. You have to have resided for at least 2 years prior to service, pay your property taxes. It's a disqualifying event if you don't pay your property taxes. And for the obvious reason, you have to pay the property taxes. Now, you can defer the payment if you're in an installment agreement, or you can defer the collection of the taxes, or if there's an abatement of the collection of the delinquent taxes. But if you have delinquent taxes, you need to let the chief appraiser know, or your board, so he can refer that to the chief appraiser, and they will get with your counsel as to how to address that. Removal from the board for failure to pay taxes, in the past, what I've told clients is that's done by what is known as a quo warranto, which is an action brought in court, filing to remove a board member from the constituent body. Never done that. I've gotten close, but it can be very, very unpleasant for both sides. So pay your property taxes. Next slide. Here we can see that there's qualifications here for the large counties, which Nueces is. The members of the CAD, you can only serve 5 terms. That really doesn't kick into until January 1st of 2022. So if you were serving as a board member, as an elected, or as an appointed, or if you were an appointed before you became an elected, if you were serving in that basis before 2022, it does not count against you. It counting now. So in 2032, if you've hit 5 terms, 10 years, you can't serve again. Unless, and we always put this, legislature's in session. We don't know what they're going to do. I think they'll stay away from this one, because this one is flying under the radar. Next slide, please. Appraisers can't serve on the board at all. They're explicitly excluded from serving on the CAD board. Appraisers are people who go out and appraise property. Doesn't necessarily mean a real estate agent. Matter of fact, I welcome those. But an appraiser, a fee appraiser, and a member of the Appraisal Institute, or a member of the residential group related to appraisals, cannot serve on the Appraisal District Board of Directors. And if they've engaged in appraising property for compensation, what does that mean? If they've represented a property owner before the ARB and they're being paid for that, or if they've appraised property for use in litigation, that's also a clear conflict of interest. But if you have an appraiser who wants to serve on the board, they cannot have represented a property owner or have worked and presented appraisals for compensation before this board, before the district or the appraisal review board. Next slide, please. CAD employees, that's pretty straightforward. You can't have, there's no real revolving door here. Unlike many other institutions, you cannot, once you finish an employment here, you can't just wind up serving on the CAD board. Next slide. And a lot of these are just bullet points, and I'll be glad to hand out the 118 slides or send it to y'all so you can have this. Don't be closely related to somebody who appraises property for compensation. In other words, if your spouse is an appraiser or a tax agent who happens to be an appraiser and he's representing a couple of hundred taxpayers before the appraisal review board, you can't serve on the CAD board. That's a clear conflict of interest, no matter how big of a wall you build around that. So just be careful about your relations and what they're doing before the appraisal review board or the CAD board. The same thing on the second one there. This is one of those that it's a class, you'll see these. There's a couple of these that are criminal in nature. This is a Class B, so if you're found and charged with this and go through the process and found guilty of it, you get up to 180 days in the pokey, $2,000 fine, or, both of those. So they are serious about this. And there's a few of these in the tax code. Next slide, please. This is the difference here. This is how the CAD governance has changed. And it depends on the population size of the counties. We talked about this earlier. 5 elected members, appointed members, I'm doing it. 5 elected members appointed members are elected by your taxing units. They each get a number of votes. There is a statutory process for that. That's in the tax code. And it's got its own deadlines. Chief appraiser is the administrator of that. They manage it. They send out notices to special districts who conduct their election first for their nominee. That runs on a separate timeline. And then your normal districts. Special districts are like levy districts, mud districts, reclamation district, conservation districts. They run on a different timeline, but they're still entitled to representation on the board if they have enough votes. And their voting allocations are kind of squirrely. But shorthand matter is every single tax unit gets a vote based on their pro rata share of the levy that they impose. And you break it out, and then there's even more of a derivations of how those votes are calculated. It is not subject to the Texas Election Code. There are deadlines in there, but unlike the Texas Election Code, which you and Mr. Cuzgon, but you 3 guys went through, you have some leeway in the appointed members. In the other one under the Election Code, you need counsel on that, because if you don't cross that T, don't cross that I, or dot the I, you're toast, absolute toast, because the election code is absolutely unforgiving. You cannot miss anything on that. So, as a matter of fact, when we went through the election process, we went out and retained election code counsel, because it is very, very complicated. Of course, nobody in my field had done this when they passed the Senate Bill 2 in 22. The difference now, you got 5 elected members, which they're elected, but they're really appointed by the taxing units. The 3 members are elected by the general public. The tax assessor collector now serves as an ex officio member and gets to vote. Before this, the tax assessor collector served as an ex officio member, but could not vote, could not make a motion unless the CAD board passed a policy allowing that assessor collector to make a motion or to second. So they had limited authority. Now the tax assessor collector is a full participating member of the board. One other thing, tax units cannot change the number of members or the selection procedure. That was eliminated by the passage of Senate Bill 2. The taxing units can't provide for staggered terms. It used to have staggered terms, and this is for populous counties like y'all. You're not going to go back down below 75,000. So for the foreseeable future, this is y'all's life. And they can know, and most importantly, taxing units cannot disapprove of board action under the general disapproval statute under section 6.10. Prior to this, if this CAD took action by way of motion, debate, vote, policy, resolution, whatever, and it's an official action, once that action was made known to the taxing units, they, within 15 days, could disapprove of that action. And if enough of them disapproved that action under the general board disapproval statute, section 6.10, the change made by the board was of no effect, and you'd have to go back and try it again. Can't happen anymore. You cannot do that anymore. It has been removed by the new I think I've got a typo there, 60301, it's not 31. So there's been some changes in your governance method, and I think the reason they changed and removed the authority to disapprove actions is because of the election of your countywide officials. That's why I think there's no legislative history on that. That's the only thing that makes sense to me. You don't want a bunch of tax units coming in and changing the vote of an elected official who's been duly elected in a countywide election. But all you need to know is that once you make a decision here, it can't be set aside by statutory action but of the constituent tax units. Next slide, please. The governance is what you guys do on not a day-to-day basis, but that's what y'all deal with at y'all board meetings and the lead-ups to it. Let's talk about qualified immunity. And this is the one that I would particularly ask you to pay attention to, because this is where board members get into trouble. And in getting into trouble, I mean politically, getting into trouble in the media, getting into trouble with the public opinion, getting into trouble by being sued on a personal basis. Qualified immunity, the question, can you get sued for being on the board? Yeah, for anything. And I've seen stuff happen that you wouldn't think would happen, but you can get sued for showing up late to a board meeting, which I have seen. Get sued for it. Is it worth anything? It's worth the paper it's written on, but you get sued for that. The key here is you guys have qualified immunity. Absolute immunity is kind of like Captain America. Hold that shield up, as long as you got it in front of you, kapwang, nothing is going to get to you. Or even better, Superman, nothing is going to get to you. Qualified immunity is limited, and that means stay in your lanes. And we'll get to what your lanes are. Your lanes are budgetary, discharging statutory duties as outlined in the Texas Tax Code, or your policies. If you stay in your lanes there, then if you're sued, your most capable counsel will defend you and try to get you out of that suit. If you're within the lanes of your authority, that should be an easy dismissal. If you're outside the lanes of your authority, you need to call your own lawyer, because you're not engaging in your statutorily authorized duties. Example, y'all can't appraise property. Y'all can make decisions that impact how property gets appraised. But you can't tell the chief appraiser that building's too low in value. One, because you can't talk to him about a property. It's a criminal violation to do that. But if it gets back to him that you want to get a building value raised, can't do that. That's outside your authority. You cannot raise values, lower values, determine what exemptions are or not to be granted. Here's a real life story. One of my clients had a board member who did dual capacity, served on a major taxing unit, also served on the board. That board member decided that his tax base was a little bit too low and convinced a couple of other board members. This is back in the late 90s. Let's go take a look and see what these properties look like. So far, there's nothing really wrong about this, except for perhaps having a quorum of board members riding around in a van, which is what happened, picking out buildings and saying, that building is too low, and buffaloing the chief appraiser and staff to raise the value. And of course, chief appraiser doesn't know, I don't know, because the value just shows up on the appraisal roll. Property owners, of course, come in screaming mad because the value has been doubled. And as they start looking into it, they figure out that that is what happened. A group of board members, including members from another constituent tax unit, drove around and decided that the values were too low and got the values raised. When we got the suit filed, it named the appraisal district as a defendant, as they should, and each and every single one of those board members, not in an official capacity, which I'm sure y'all have seen, you see the chief appraiser in the official capacity, but in their personal capacity, and sought monetary damages from them. The monetary damages were measured by the amount of taxes that this property was illegally raised. And so when I got the lawsuit, we started looking into it, called up my friend who was the one who had filed the suit and asked him what had happened, and he disgorged all the material, and that suit got settled in about, had the meeting with clients. I said, explain to them what I just did to you. You need to get your own attorney because we can't defend you unless we get this settled like right now. And it got settled that afternoon, but it is that type of stepping outside the line, which that's pretty crazy, but you need to be careful that you have strictly defined lines of authority. You have some gray areas how to get things done, but you can't go out there and do some direct action on particular properties, particular exemptions, particular values or things of that nature. There's ways to affect that, but it's not that directly. Next, personal liability. What does that mean? The means that you get into your pocket and you pay for it, and you pay for your own attorney. So that is a serious, serious thing to think about. The next time you decide, think about maybe that value, think about an exemption that should not or should have been granted. So that's the way to bring that up. Bring it up to your TLO, let them bring it to chief appraiser, something of that nature, not directly. Next slide. These are organizational duties. Y'all have done a bunch of this already. I'm sorry, go ahead. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I'm also the tax assessor collector.
Yes.
And so in my capacity, if we had a complaint from a taxpayer, it's okay for me to reach out to them and
Yes.
say, we've had this complaint, as long as I don't get involved in, you need to do this, you need to do that.
That is
Transfer
correct.
Transfer them to them and let them make the decision.
The assessor collector has special role. They've got to do their job. You've got to assess and collect, you've got to interact with property owners, taxpayers. So if you get a complaint, you can just pass it through to the chief appraiser because that's part of your job and your statutory duty as an assessor collector. If any of you board members receive a complaint, and we'll touch on this, I have a slide for that. If we touch on this, if you get a complaint from a property owner or from anybody regarding any operation, any aspect of the district, you can pass that on to the chief appraiser in writing without comment. So you can give it to your TLO can give it to the chief appraiser without comment, and the chief appraiser can determine how to follow up on that. Y'all have most of these done. At your meetings, even though you've got a mix of appointed and elected members, at first meeting, you still elect a board chair and secretary. You're required to hold board meetings at least once a quarter. Most metro districts, large districts like this, have it on a monthly basis. Now you get to appoint and replace. I forgot to place appoint in there. Appoint and replace ARB members. ARB members are now within y'all's jurisdiction. Last year, the administrative law judge appointed the ARB members, and that was just another thing that they no longer have to do, so it's back in y'all's lap. And you can replace the ARB members. There's a statutory complicated method for how to replace them. It's kind of weird, but if there's a complaint about an ARB member, you go through the process, and we'll touch on that later. You go through the chair of the ARB. And if the error is not rectified, it's not the offending ARB member who comes off, it's the chair of the ARB. Motivates them to get the error fixed. Next slide, please. Fiscal matters. You approve the budget, and we'll talk in detail about that later. You approve CADs, contracts, and purchases. All your contracts should be approved and signed by the board chair. If for nothing else, that gives the appearance that the board approved that contract. In many instances, you have designated people who can sign contracts. My opinion has always been, have the board chair sign it and have the secretary attest it or another board member sign off that they've seen the signature as it's being executed. As part of your contracting and purchases, you have policies with regard to that, and we'll talk about policy a little bit later. You should, I haven't seen your policy, but I am guessing, and it's a good bet, y'all have detailed CAD contract and purchasing policies, and we'll talk in detail about that. And then you select the district depository. You do that every 2 years. That's the bank that holds your money and gives you back that magnificent, 2% a year for the honor of holding your money. You have to do that every 2 years, but you can extend that for a single 2-year term. And that's subject to a request for proposal process that should go out when you're looking for new depository banks. And then an annual audit, financial audit, and that's done always by an outside accounting firm who comes in and then usually spend time on site with the CAD staff, chief appraiser, and financials. Usually there's interaction between the auditors and key members of the board to do a full financial audit, and that's every year. The district is one of the most transparent entities in the state of Texas. Unique to the budget, and we'll talk about it later on, is it is not quite a zero-sum budget, but it's pretty close. Every year, whatever is left over in your budget is either credited or refunded to the taxing units unless it has been specifically obligated for a specific purpose by the board. Next slide, please. Policies, your reappraisal plan, you do that also. The reappraisal plan started several years ago, and when it first came out, people were just putting it together, and they were all pretty much kind of cookie cutter. Now they've got very, very specific to individual jurisdictions because every property is different, every county is different, so that is something that your chief appraiser prepares for y'all. It's basically the district's work plan, what they're going to do, how they're going to do it, and their timeline for doing it. A lot of the timeline is set by statute, but there's still, how do you get to that timeline? You'll see the details of what your chief appraiser and staff are planning for the appraisal district. Reasonable access, that means that you have to, I heard somebody ask for public comment. You have to have that to provide public comments or access for people who can't come in, people who are limited in their physical ability. You have to provide that specifically in your policies. Non-English speakers and people with disabilities. Then you have to have a complaint process for the public, and that complaint process is for anything. And it can be as detailed as you want. It can be as generalized as you want. I've always advised clients with regard to policies, and I'll defer to your counsel, but if you're going to write a policy, make sure that you abide by it, because if you have a super, super detailed policy and you miss something, there's trouble. There's trouble in Corpus Christi. You need to give your chief appraiser and this district a little bit of leeway in your policies. You can't, for example, all complaints must be turned in single-spaced, 8.5 by 11, 14-point font, or they will be rejected. Something like that is just too oppressive. You need to have something that's generalized but gives some specific guidelines for the contents of the policy. I've always thought if you can over policy yourself to death. So give yourself some leeway in those policies, just as a general rule. Next slide, please. This is the new one. You now appoint the ARB members. Have you all gone through that?
Yes.
Okay. And it's going to depend how you do it. It's a learning process. A bunch of appraisal districts I had, ARB members were appointed. They were solicited by a variety of means. And ARB members are like Coca-Cola machines in the desert because they are hard to find. A lot of them do not, they're just a hard group of individuals to find to serve. It's a difficult job. It serves during the summertime. They give up their summer vacation. A lot of people are retired, and they want to spend time with their grandkids and just being retired. But it is a difficult job. Some of my my CAD clients appointed ARB members. I don't know if y'all did it directly, if y'all conducted the interview, or if you appointed a committee to do the first run through them. All of that is perfectly fine, but it should be embodied in a policy. And I can tell you this, a lot of appraisal districts are behind on their policy because of all these changes. They're having to change everything. But if you do decide to, when you do your policies, that's something you should include in there, the process for appointing your ARB members. Who does the vetting? Is it a committee who does the initial interview? Is it the TLO, the taxpayer liaison, who does the original vetting on this? Or is it the committee members who do it? Or is it the chief appraiser? Things of that nature. As long as it's consistent, you need to have some type of consistency of who has a responsibility with regard to the selection, vetting, and appointment of, and recommendation for appointment of ARB members. Taxpayer liaison officer, that's not required for anybody over 120,000. Their authority and their duties have magnified very, very much over the past several years. They used to interact with the administrative law judge. They don't do that anymore, but they do interact with y'all in terms of, collecting your ARB members. They handle, handle complaints from taxpayers, bring it to the district chief appraiser if necessary, or to the district's board. Pardon me. Or they bring it to the district's board. They're required to make presentation of the complaints on a regular basis. I don't know how the TLO does it here, but the larger the district, the more formalized the complaint and reporting procedures are. And you can take action on any of those complaints as required, as needed. You can assign duties to them. Some appraisal districts assign duties to their TLO after you've completed, working with the ARB members and their taxpayer protests. Ensure that you hand out, internal surveys to see how the appraisal districts do. Some of them do that. Others have more detailed policies and procedures, and it's up to the board. As long as you delegate it to them, a TLO is required to do it. Of course, you can't delegate that, go out and get a Whataburger for us or anything like that. But as long as it's within the purview of y'all's authority, you can delegate them to discharge that duty. And I did not bring the appraisal district director's manual. It's about 60 pages, but I'll be glad to send it to you. It's online. It's got the full set of duties on there for the other CAD operators. Once again, I'll keep going back to this. You do not hire and fire or evaluate any member, any staff member, any employee of the district, except for the chief appraiser and the TLO. And you do hire the ARBs. Question as to whether they're employees or contractors, kind of beyond the scope of this presentation, but those are the only three categories of the people that you hire or terminate. Next slide, please. Next. This is just a schematic of what you do. Establish the CAD, hire the chief, vacancies on the CAD board, action on the ARB rule violations, and we'll get to that in a bit. Next, adopt, define your reappraisal plan, and approve of contracts for firms and other services. Next, policies in writing. We haven't spoken about this, but Nueces is a huge agricultural community. You have to consent to the chief appraiser's selections for the Ag Advisory Board. Ag Advisory Board is comprised of 3 individuals with extensive experience in agricultural activities within the county, and they advise the chief appraiser in terms of how the agricultural activities impact, and they use the information from them to help them generate their land schedules for calculation of agricultural use valuation. There's a bit different. Everything is appraised at market value. ag use valuation is a special breed of animal. If you got 20 acres out there, might be worth $1 million an acre, commercial market value. But if it's being used for agricultural use, it's only gonna be up, it's gonna have a special valuation of maybe $10 an acre. That's because it's an agricultural use. And there's a very complicated net to land calculation. They take leases to figure out what the per acre value it should be for special ag use valuation. And that's one of the things that your ag use advisors do. And then we've already talked about selecting the TLO. Next slide, please. We can flip through this because we talked about this. You already have a nice building. It's perfect. It's right across from the police department. This is kind of common sense. As y'all are growing, and I'll say I have not been to Nueces in a couple of years. It has grown dramatically. I represent Clayburgh. And when I was here last December, I drove in here. It's not the same corpus that it was even 5 years ago. It's growing dramatically. So these are common sense things, you know, start looking at your economy, looking at the growth. Chief Appraiser's got all the data you need in terms of sales, residential property, buildings coming in, businesses coming in. You need to start thinking about, you know, always have in the back of your mind, how is this district going to grow and how are we going to address those needs? You can, and there's a specific process for going through all this in terms of purchasing a new building or purchasing land for development of new building, or if you're going to do a major remodel of your current building. And I'll touch on that. The next slide. Yeah, and this is the process for establishing, and this applies also for major remodels. If you're gonna do a major remodel, like add a third floor to this, you have to go through this process, because that's a major remodel of the building. You have to get 3/4 of your taxing units to approve the budget, and you can't just go to them. You've got to come up with plans, alternatives. You actually have to go and make appointments with them and say, here's what we want to do, here's the alternatives. There's a 3-4 story building down the road, but it's 30 years older, and it costs X amount. We think if we put the 3rd story on ourselves, it's gonna be less, and we're staying there, we're not disrupting. And you go through all of your, you, Chief Appraiser, and staff go to all the constituent taxing units. After you all have approved the purchasing of this property, and then they get their ducks lined up in a row, and then they send out the proposal, and the 3/4 of the taxing units must approve that proposal to purchase that. So you can't just go out and buy it. So that's why I say, if you're thinking about the growth here, bear in mind that there is a fairly lengthy process that you have to go through as a board and a district to purchase or do a major renovation of a building. If you want to paint this or, you know, raise the ceiling tile on this, that's probably not going to go through that process, because that's just, you know, maintenance or something of that nature. Any questions about whether it's a major renovation or not, contact your council. And then again, you got to include all your costs, because the cost, you have to go out and get financing, you have to bid for that, and get an appraisal on it, which should not be a problem. And you have to present all of this to the board, to the boards of the taxing units. Comes to the board first, they come up with the project, and then you go to the taxing units. Next, the hiring and evaluate the chief appraiser. As a matter of policy, you can go to next, that's just a header. Look at that. I can work dropping in a picture. This is what the chief appraiser does. That's the 3 main things. He runs the appraisal district. He runs the appraisal district. He runs the day in, day out, weekend out, night in, night out operation of the appraisal district. He creates and maintains the appraisal roll. And the appraisal roll is what eventually becomes your taxing roll. I mean, if he falls short of getting that appraisal roll out, you don't get an appraisal roll, which becomes your tax roll. You don't get to send out tax bills. tax unions don't get to set their tax rates and send out tax bills and collect taxes. So it's a very, very vital function to get that appraisal roll out on time in July. Once again, I'll refer you to the appraisal district directors, but that's the main function of your chief appraiser. And of course, you can always delegate other duties to him, and I could give you ideas, but for example, some appraisal districts, they delegate to the chief appraiser taxpayer outreach. Go out at least once or twice a month and do presentations to the Lions Club, taxpayer workshops, go to the service clubs, have meetings or rendition workshops, things of that nature. So you can assign things like that. They're more as part of their evaluation or job requirement and duties. Next, please. Once again, he serves, this is basically the little dot here. That is the bullet point for what a chief appraiser's relationship vis-a-vis the board is. Y'all set the policy objectives and goals by way of written policy or directives. He executes them, he or she executes them. And these are just, once again, common sense, resignation, retirement, or death. You have to acknowledge that. You should have a succession plan. Not that Ron's leaving anytime soon, but there's buses here. If you step off and you get hit by a bus, you have to have a succession plan. Succession plan can be very detailed, such as going through you have to have at least somebody here who can step in and take over the duties in case something happens. That's the interim chief appraiser. You would do that at a meeting. For example, if there's a chief appraiser vacancy due to death, termination, accident, illness, anything like that, if for some reason the acting chief appraiser cannot discharge the duties, you will be asked to, as the board, to appoint an interim chief appraiser by official action. You will be the ones conducting the interviews. You will be the ones who qualify and vet that individual, relying, of course, on advice from counsel and advice from your staff members, trusted staff members. And this is a side. Get to know your key staff members. Because they are a font of wisdom. They know what's going on here. They can, in case something like this happens, you can count on them to relate back to you, we think this person can do this, or this is something that you need to be aware of. So you don't have to be buddy-buddy with all the staff appraisers here, because honestly, a lot of staff members see the board and they see you coming in and coming out. But with your key members, be familiar with them. Chief appraiser probably does that by having key members, or can have key members come in, make presentations to the board of their duties at monthly board meetings. Might stretch it out a little bit more, but you get to see what they're doing, understand what they're doing, and actually get to see the individual and put a name to the face who's doing all the work. Not that you don't work. You delegate. It's a lot of work. And you can have written procedures for how you seek applicants in case you have to do a full-blown search. And once again, consult with your counsel as how you would do that. Next slide. A written job description. If all else fails, if you don't have one, you've got one. It's this. Salary range, you've got to pay your chief appraiser. You have to pay your chief appraiser because there's 254 counties in Texas. There's 252 CADs, I think. There's less than 245 chief appraiser positions because a couple of them overlap. They are far and few between. So be aware that it's very difficult to find a chief appraiser. I've been involved with chief appraiser searches that may take as long as 6 to 8 months. Unless you're prepared to engage in a lull in administration of that long, you need to pay the chief appraiser. Their market is something like this is well into 6 figures, and that's just a matter of record. Then you do the selection process. Once again, your selection process, if not set by policy, it can be set at the board meeting. You once again want to have an open procedure for how you're going to go about retaining a chief appraiser, whether it be a permanent one or an interim one. Next slide, please. Williamson CAD, that's kind of northwest of Austin. There's a chief appraiser description. And it's basically, it's a shorthand. It's probably the best summary I've seen of everything that's here in the tax code. Next slide. And this is just how you go about doing it. Consider your current managers. TAAD, Texas Association of Appraisal Districts, and Texas Association of Assessing Officers are the two main umbrella groups that cover both aspects of appraisal and collection. Those are very, very good sources for advertising any vacancies for chief appraisers, or chief appraiser uses them for advertising for qualified staff members also. Next slide. Once again, just general, hiring and evaluation techniques. There are firms who will come in and do this for you and present you something either all tied up in a bow for an interim or permanent if needed, or we'll do the vetting and you guys do the rest. But this is just, if you've ever hired anybody for your job, or if you've gone through the interview process, this is just an encapsulation of what it should be. Some people ask, is it required that the chief appraiser reside within the county? It is not. It is not. The tax code does not require that at all. It does require him to not have delinquent taxes. And I don't think that matters where if they're in a neighboring county or not. You should not have delinquent taxes. Next slide. Qualifications of chief appraiser now have a permanent record as an RPA. That's a registered professional appraiser. Where do they have it? It's at the under the occupations code. Under the occupations code, they report a link to TDLR, the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation, who is the authority, the licensing authority in charge of RPAs. They keep a record of the comptroller's results of every single MAP review. I'm using a lot of acronyms, but MAP review is called Methods and Assistance Program. That is a study done by the comptroller every 2 years on the operations of the appraisal district. And there's a set of lists. They're pass, fail, pass, fail, pass, fail. Some are a little bit more substantive. But if it's a fail, the results will be at the TDLR. And if there's a fail there, you're going to get that. So when you're doing conducting a search for interim or whatever in terms of chief appraiser, get that data because it'll tell you the results of their maps. And that's how they're graded. That's how chief appraiser is graded and the appraisal district is graded. One of the ways they're graded. Next slide, please. They should have the RPA. There's a special exception if a chief appraiser doesn't have an RPA. They have a certain amount of time to get it in, but you can require the completion of the RPA designation, or absolutely require you got to have an RPA before you apply for this. Next slide. And here's a couple of disqualifications. The chief can't be an officer of a taxing unit or an employee of a taxing unit that participates in the district. So your chief appraiser can't be a teacher at school district here. Your chief appraiser can't be the secretary of a board of a school district here. They just can't do that because it's clear that is a conflict. And remember what I spoke about earlier, the constitutional separation of appraisal and assessment. That's another reason you'll see this theme throughout the tax code. There's specific training that the chief appraisers have to do, which y'all also have to do in some instances. CAD duties, CAD finances are very, very different than anything else because they don't generate their own funding. Unlike the school district or the city or the county where they're dependent on taxes coming in, This district does not generate any of its own funding. They generate some income from copying, sending out public information records, maybe interest that's generated by your interest-bearing account, that's y'all's money. But their funding is directly and solely provided by the taxing units. So it's a different type of a financing system. They have to take open meetings, open records, ethics, and just maintain independence from the political pressures, public media, things of that nature. That's, again, I touched on this earlier. You know, it's always a good idea to have your chief appraiser show up at public forums, just to be seen, you know, and, or his delegate. You can send your delegate also. It doesn't have to necessarily be you. Next slide. Again, don't hire somebody who has delinquent taxes. I don't care where it is. If the chief appraiser lives in a neighboring county and he's got delinquent taxes there and he's a chief appraiser, you got a problem. Somebody is going to raise Cain over that. So just don't do it. Or make him or her bring those taxes up to date. And once again, the same type of relationship restrictions. You can't have somebody who appraises property appear and become the chief appraiser. You can't have a contract. You can't employ a contract with a chief appraiser's spouse. You can't employ a chief appraiser's spouse or their child at the district. Have that. One of them's going to have to go. And those are just kind of common sense. The last one is absolute common sense, especially in today's day and time. As part of your vetting process, criminal background. You've got to do that. You have to do that. Next slide, please. And they serve at the pleasure of the board. And you've heard me say that several times. That's what the code says. They serve at the pleasure of the board. And so y'all's duty is you evaluate them regularly, give feedback on the performance, and compensate them as necessary, including performance reviews, performance bonuses, performance raises, but they do serve at y'all's pleasure. Next slide, please. Sample evaluation, and I'm assuming y'all have one here also, but that's just a sample evaluation, and they're all personalized to the specific jurisdiction.
Real quick.
Yes, sir.
Could you all send that sample evaluation, because that's kind of been a issue of that, how do you, when you're not working with them day to day, how do you evaluate somebody who you're not directly working? And that's always been I've been here for 13 years as tax assessor collector, and that's always been a challenge,
It is,
it's kind of an awkward position for the board. It's probably an awkward position for the chief appraiser, because we're not working hands-on with them, so how do you evaluate them?
I will send you some samples, but that's common, unless you're here every day or it's very difficult. But these are pretty basic. What are you doing? How are you doing it? So I'll be glad to send them
Sure.
here.
Thank you.
Next slide. I think it's page 2. Yeah, next one. Next. There we go. Yeah, Williamson has it. And here we go. We've talked a little bit about this. When I said, a second in command, that's a deputy chief. You can name that person whatever you want to, deputy chief, assistant chief, but whatever the nomenclature is for this second, the number 2, you've got to know who that person is in case there's a vacancy or an absence of administrative power. Next slide. And here is what the chief appraiser does and what you don't do. And we bolded this because that is what you do not do. The chief appraiser appraises property. That's his primary function. That is not y'all's function at all. And I know it's really difficult because, everybody's got an opinion. The property should be worth. Everybody has history with the property. Resist the temptation, resist it mightily to talk to the chief appraiser about this, because once again, that's a criminal violation to talk to the chief appraiser about a specific property or a specific property owner's property, except unless it is inside an open meeting like this or an executive session. Any other conversation with the chief appraiser about a specific property or property owner is a criminal violation.
I have a quick question too
Yeah.
on that. Is there, and you may already be getting to this, but are there any special rules for the board of directors on how they deal with their appraisal,
Your personal one?
their personal
That's-
appraisals?
That's the exception. The statute goes on to say you can't talk to anybody about, the chief appraiser about a specific property owner or property unless it's yours. If it's yours, you can talk to the chief appraiser about that. Most chief appraisers either handle it directly or send them directly to the ARB. So that way the chief appraiser is completely out of it and let the ARB decide.
Either that or we ask the board member, he has or she has a consultant, a tax
Correct.
consultant.
Correct, yeah.
And that keeps the scenario of
It's,
having your hand in the kitty.
yeah, it's the appearance of impropriety,
There you go.
that the board member is talking directly to a chief appraiser. Perfectly legal to do that, to talk about, hey, my property value is too high. But just think about the appearance. Y'all are the ones who hire and fire him, and he's talking to the chief appraiser. You have my value too high. It just does not pass the smell test. So most chief appraisers do what you do, send them to the ARB and let the ARB decide, or talk to the tax consultant. Next slide. And then once again, it's only $500. It's Class C misdemeanor, but I'm not sure, it's per event. So if you talk to the chief appraiser 5 or 6 times about somebody's property, that's 5 or 6 times you gotta pay $500. How would somebody find out about it? You would be surprised. Communication does not mean, communication does not mean what we are doing here right now, just talking. Communication means the killer of public officials, your phone or your emails. This has gotten so many public officials, and y'all are public officials, into trouble. So communication means any type of communication. I've got a degree in radio and television, spent 4 years learning all about communications. Communication can be verbal, nonverbal. They're both just as easy to prove. So be aware of those circumstances. Next. Ex parte communications, you can, again, ex parte communications means you're talking one-on-one with an authoritative body, authoritative individual like chief appraiser or member of the board of directors. And this is when you can talk to the chief appraiser. You can communicate open meeting like we are now, closed meeting with your CAD attorneys in there with you for closed session, and closed session have limitations on also. We talked earlier about this, written complaints by owners or a taxing unit can be passed on to the chief appraiser with no comment if it's about appraisal of a specific property. And I believe you asked about this, the assessor collector can communicate with the chief about certification, correction, and collection of an account. You're doing your duty, your job. Next. And this is a new one, not particularly new, but it says that a member of a governing body, officer, or employee of a tax unit can't communicate with the district. Not just the chief appraiser. Could mean an employee, could mean legal staff, it could mean any employee for the purpose of influencing the value of property which the district is appraising. That's very generic. It's very generic, but be aware that is out there.
Can they still, under that statute, protest a value class of their properties?
I'm sorry?
Did that remove their ability to protest a value class of their properties, or can they still do that?
They can still
So
do
let's
that,
say-
yeah.
Like, let's say for y'all's purposes, a homesteads in X district are too low. They can still protest that
Can.
class of
They can,
properties. Okay.
yeah.
They just can't go specific.
Correct, yeah.
It's categories of property.
Yeah.
That happened several years ago Mr. Mont represented the appraisal district.
On
Had to do with Port
Port
Aransas.
Aransas.
And
with the
that's-
silica
yes.
plant, yeah.
And the appraisal district won.
Yeah, I remember that, yeah. I got to tour that, that thing is, it's amazing. And once again, if it's about your own property, you can talk about that.
Right.
$500, I mean, it's a Class A misdemeanor. That's serious jail time. That is serious jail time.
Who gets the $500? Appraisal district?
I'm not gonna find out. I don't want anybody here to find out, okay? Next one. Vacancies, just flip that. How, if there's a vacancy on the board, basically, if there's a vacancy on the board, and this is, once again, common sense, some of it is in the code, but if you have a vacancy on the board, once again, disqualification or removal or things of that nature, there's a specific way to fill that vacancy. Next slide, please. And it's in the tax code. At the ARB, I mean, when you have your first meeting, you elect a chair, a secretary. It's just, vote, rather motion, debate, vote. Next. And we've talked about this. Quorum, 9, that means 5. 5 of you've got to be here. Have had a couple of questions as with 5 members, sometimes quorum's a little bit more difficult. Can we do Zoom meetings? No. Zoom meetings are now dead. The governor killed that a couple of years ago. That was special provision for the COVID pandemic where you could have remote Zoom meetings. You cannot do that. You can have a member or less than a quorum, attend a meeting via Zoom, but you must have a quorum, a live quorum in one physical location, and your other members can Zoom in or phone in, but you've got to post it that it's going to be a Zoom meeting or a remote type of meeting. It requires specific links on your meeting so the public can Zoom in also. So get with your counsel if you decide to do that, or if you do run into a continuing problem. 5 out of 9 is a little bit more difficult than doing 3 out of 5, or 4 out of 6 when you have the assessor collector on there. Next one, please. And there's what I just talked about. Once we talked about that also, once a quarter meeting. Public information, I alluded a little bit to it, because there's public information and then there's open meetings. They are related in terms of the biggest problems that those two areas of the law can cause for taxpayers, not for taxpayers, but for board members. Public information, you've got to take the open government training within 90 days of taking the oath. If you all have ever served on any other public entity, you've probably taken it. I would suggest that you go back to the, I believe it's on the Attorney General website, and there's a link there. It's about 45 minutes or an hour to take that and get recertified, because the statutes have changed, and they'll give you a certificate. Give that to the chief appraiser, because that is part of the MAP review. Have all your board members taken the open meeting and public information training. If you don't have it there, it's a strike against the appraisal district. Next slide. Here's some key points. Some of this is anecdotal, some of this is just experience. Have a CAD email. You should have a CAD email for business purposes. I know it's something else you don't want to keep up with, but it's easier for you if you have a dedicated CAD email for any interactions related to the appraisal district. Because anytime you talk about or you communicate via email or text regarding district business, public information. Anything on this phone is public information. They can get to my phone if they want to see all communications that I've communicated with ABC CAD. They can get to the phone, physical phone, to extract all those emails related to district business. So I usually tell board members, have an email for CAD only business, and make sure that's part of your written policies. It's a little bit more work, but it avoids a lot of problems. It avoids people wanting to get into your personal devices. By personal devices, I mean phones. I mean pagers. from the 80s, your emails on your home workstation, your emails at work. So it doesn't matter the device. If you've conducted firm or public business regarding your entity on it, it's potentially discoverable or by a member of the public. Once again, private email, if you have it sent to your home address or your home emails, they can get to it. I picked this up when I was in Vegas and went to the Mob Museum, and I thought it was appropriate. John Gotti, the all-time Teflon Don, don't ever say anything you don't want played back to you someday. What you write down here in these meetings, public information. Your notes could be potentially public information. Don't write down anything you don't want to explain. I always tell board members that I'm training, do not write down anything you do not want to explain, because I've seen terrible things where board member writes down disparaging comments about a presenter or a member of the public, even worse, and the member of the public asks for the information and it's disclosed. So y'all are public officials, you're held, one, to a higher standard. You just are. It's just the way it is. And since you're held to a higher standard, you've got to be aware that there's a lot of more risks that apply because of that higher standard. So that, I think, is, if you get nothing else out of this, remember that. Next slide. Open meeting, 72 hours before, chief appraiser handles all this. And you have your required quarterly meetings and then your monthly meetings. Special meetings, those can be called by the board chair, and it's just a special meeting that we need to do it for this special purpose. Emergency meetings are different. Emergency meetings mean that there's really a dire situation that puts the public in danger. Therefore, we must have an emergency meeting. And that means that you shorten the 72 hours. You can have an emergency meeting without the 72-hour, 3-day waiting period. Special meeting, 72 hours, 3-day waiting period. Your board of directors can act on the items that are on the agenda. If it's not on the agenda, I can't recall if y'all's agenda has got a catch-all at the end that says items from the board of directors. And that's where the board of directors say, hey, can you put this on the agenda for next week or the next month that we meet? Or just talk to your chair. I want to put this on the agenda. The board chair is the one who determines normally what gets on the agenda. Next slide, please. Executive session. I noticed you didn't have one today, but executive sessions are pretty limited. You consult with your attorney for litigation, personnel matters, with regard to purchasing the property, anything that requires the attendance of your counsel that is required by the Texas bar rules to maintain attorney-client privilege. Now remember, your lawyer must be there. You can't, to maintain that attorney-client privilege, if you're going to claim that as an exception, that I'm meeting with my lawyer, I'm claiming an executive session because of attorney-client privilege, the lawyer's got to be there. He or she may not say anything, but they've got to be there. So that way they'll listen, and whatever you say is confidential. They can attend via phone for that type of session, but you have to have a lawyer present to establish and maintain that attorney-client privilege. Personnel matters, if you have a personnel matter, you can discuss that in an executive session. Generally best, and I'll defer to counsel here, but depending on the status of the individual or the individual's position, you probably should list the name of the individual that is being discussed. And why is that? Because that individual has the right to request that the executive session that the matter be held in open meeting. That individual doesn't, if he doesn't know who they're talking about him, because the name is not listed, will be deprived of his right to ask for an open session. So if it's chief appraiser, deputy chief, or your minister, your upper level staff, yeah, I think you need to place that name there, or at least the title of the job description, so the individuals know who they are. Real estate, if you're purchasing, buying, selling, that should be subject to an exception. Once again, for obvious reasons, you don't want to disclose your negotiations, your strategies for purchasing, your issues you have with financing or whatever. You don't want the other guy to see what cards you're holding. Next session. And these are common Open Meetings Act violations. If something's not on the agenda, don't talk about it. It's difficult, I know, sometimes you're talking about an issue and you, just as the normal course of humans and the way our minds work, you kind of start straying off a little bit. Strain off, be aware that you need to stay as close as possible to that topic, and it'll be up to your attorney. Don't get mad at them when they say you need to get back to the agenda item because it's not listed as a topic. They're really doing you a favor, because if you discuss an item that's not on the agenda, it can lead to problems. Don't communicate with other directors about appraisal district matters outside the meeting. Emails, texts, phone calls, conference calls, meeting at social events. You can meet at social events and talk and chat about everything that's going on. How are the kids? You know, how's retirement? How, you know, what do you do for the vacation? But you can't talk about business. We say, well, there's less than two of us. I mean, there's only two of us here. We're not a quorum. It can be a problem. It can be a problem. And I'll get to that when I get down to a walking quorum. In your executive session, don't take any action. You can talk about it all you want to. You can let people know what you are going or thinking of doing, but you cannot take a straw vote. You can say, I'm inclined to do this, but you cannot take a straw vote. I'm not a fan of board members saying I'm inclined to do this at all, but it's within your authority to do that. I would advise against that. Make your positions known, because people will figure it out. We're all smart here. He doesn't like that, or she likes this, and they'll be able to figure out where this is headed. How do people find out about this if it's an executive session? One, it could be that it's recorded. Sometimes they're recorded, or there's certified agendas taken of it, or somebody within the meeting may not like the result. That's how it usually happens. Yeah, don't debate your issues that are raised in the public comment session unless it's posted. I'm not sure if you have that in your agenda items or in your policies. Some districts do. Some public comments, we're talking about the violations of the Open Meetings Act. If you have a public comment section, some districts say that public comments are limited to comments on the posted agenda items. As long as it's part of your policy and clearly posted, I think you get away with that. Is it the best practice? Once again, I'm not a fan of it, because I think public comment, members of the public can come in and say whatever they want to. You, in response, should sit there politely, nod your head, pay attention to them, and if it is important enough to you or important enough to that taxpayer or the member of the public, ask that it be agendized for a future meeting to conduct further study into it, or ask the board chair to assign somebody to look at it. But you cannot take any action on it until the next meeting. You know, the best thing to do is just ask that it be agendized for discussion at the next meeting. Then the chief appraiser can look into it and come back with a report. But under no circumstances should you engage in a substantive discussion about the point of contention by a member of the public. You're not going to win that, and you're kind of out on your own because you're not speaking on behalf of the board. The board acts as a whole, not by individuals. So it's just the best policy. I've always said, listen very politely to them. They've taken time out of their day. Listen to them, and if it's important enough to them or they ask you, and you think that it's something that merits attention, ask that it be agendized for the next meeting. Next slide. This is, back it up one more time. Up to the other one, last one. I thought I'd placed on here the walking quorum. They changed, the statute on walking quorums has changed, gotten a little bit tighter. Walking quorums, if y'all are not aware of it, a walking quorum is when a member of a board talks to another member of a board about, and they're less than a quorum, and they talk about a topic that's district business or official business. Then that other member talks to another member. There's never more than a quorum present in any of the communications. Then when it comes to the board meeting, boom, they've all talked about it. That is a walking quorum, where you've had individualized communications amongst board members about a topic. The old statute was, well, they only talked about it. They didn't really discuss about any action that they would take at a board meeting, so it's not a walking quorum. Now that has been tightened up. The statute now says that if a board member talks to another board member about a official business on a topic that they know or reasonably know will be on the agenda of the body, constitutes a walking quorum. So if you're talking about, we want to go out and get a fleet of cars, and you're talking to board member 2, I know a dealership who can get us a good deal, and this is why, and then that board, and let's talk about that. And a couple of months later, topic starts coming up, and you know you're looking to get the fleet of cars, and it's going to be an agenda item. You have a reasonable belief that it's going to be an agenda item. That's a violation of a walking quorum, and that is been the death knell of board members, because the actions on that are all actions related to that vote that arose out of the walking quorum is voidable, and in some instances is absolutely void. And there are some other potential claims that can be brought by the affected parties. For example, say if you have a vendor competition and one of the vendors learns of the walking quorum, and once again, how do they find out? Easier than you think. Cause of action by the vendor who lost out for violation of the Open Meeting Act, therefore they can set that aside, or a member of the public can simply file an injunction to stop that. So walking quorums are very, very dangerous. The best bet is don't discuss CAD business unless you're in an open meeting or a public session, or at the closed session with the rest of the board. You can have made your feelings known, directing them to your board or to the chief appraiser on issues that you can direct to the chief appraiser, not property issues. Next slide. ARB, y'all get to, next slide. You get to choose the ARB now. Before this, local admin judge appointed them. Now, you choose the ARB members. Once again, that's an indirect impact on how property is appraised here, because ultimately ARB members pass judgment on value, exemption, any matter of protest. Vet your ARB members carefully, obviously. The board names the ARB chair and secretary. The board member, names any third level board members, such as, they have a secretary, I'm not a secretary, but they may have a scheduling member. They may have somebody else who's in charge of taxpayer liaison, whatever they want to put on there besides the chair and secretary. They can create whatever officers they want to. ARB members can now be removed by the appointing authority. You're going to have some overlap because you have some ARB members that were appointed by your administrative judge, and those are shortly going away, and then you have the ones that you all appoint. The removal procedure is the same, but depending on who appointed them, that's who does the removal. If they were appointed by the admin judge, that's the individual who removes them. If y'all appointed them, y'all are the ones who remove them. Next slide. Here's your ARB members. Everybody talked about how y'all can in fact have an indirect impact on the, how the ARB determines appraised values. Y'all appoint the ARB members. When you appoint the ARB members, at least two of you guys have to be in the majority vote, or the ARB member does not get appointed. And that is specific and new in the tax code, so they're kind of like a super majority within a minority. So when you're appointing the ARB members, two of y'all must agree to the appointment of the ARB member. Less popular counties, still the
Let me back up on that real quick.
admin judge.
Let me back up on that real quick.
Yeah,
It also pretty much demands that two of them have to be present during that.
well, they have to, yeah,
Because if there's not, if two of them are absent, then we can't appoint.
that's true. You gotta be present to vote, unless there's just that strange circumstance, present, either remotely, as permitted by the code, or live and in person. You've gotta be present to vote. And that's just standard Robert Rules of Order. I'm assuming y'all are Robert's rules, that's most appraisal districts, you've got to be present to vote. Next, and you can't delegate the vote, you can't give out that proxy. If this is the removal process, just a snapshot of it. You've got 90 days to either remove them or determine that they should not be removed. There's an investigation that's conducted. Investigation is usually conducted and assigned to the TLO to conduct that. Within 90 days, you either have to remove them or by official action, make a finding that they should not be removed. That means you've got to take, motion, debate, vote. We're not going to remove them. There's been no good cause. And the ground removal has to have occurred after September 1, 2021. It sounds like a long time ago, but we've had some admin judges who just appointed ARB members last year for a 2-year term. So this will simplify itself next year when you only have board of director appointed members here. Next slide. You guys set the budget for the board training, your budget for the per diem. The ARB chair usually presents you the budget and some days. This is how long we're gonna be, this is how many members we're gonna have. Y'all set the budget for the ARB. Next slide. Once again, basically with ARB members, say good morning, how are you, see you later. And especially during the protest period, don't discuss anything with them about any hearings or any property. You can be social with them, but it's just been my experience, it's just best not to talk about them. Think of them as judges because they are quasi-judicial officials. When I'm in the court, I'll say hello to a judge, but I don't talk to him about anything else. You don't want to overstep your bounds and put them in a position of having to just think about ex parte communications. This is a fun one. You can't talk to an ARB member about the training courses they've taken. Comptroller's office provides the training course for them. You cannot talk to them about the training courses. Like, well, didn't they teach you that when you're looking at a property, you should consider this? Talking to them about the training course, that's just, again, another little known fact in the code that prohibits you from discussing the assessment or the appraisal of property with ARB members or the people who set the value, which is frankly chief appraiser and ultimately ARB. They will set some values. Next. Annual budget. We'll talk a bit about the budget here. Fiscal year, calendar year?
Calendar.
Okay, calendar years. If there's some districts that are on a weird year. There's deadlines here. You gotta adopt your budget before 7/15. There's certain things you gotta do. You gotta send the budget to the taxing units and gotta let the taxing units input on this and have a public hearing. All of this work, you've gotta adopt it before September 15th. So I'm assuming right now you guys are working on budgets. Recall I spoke earlier about why the budget's different. It is, like I said, almost a zero-sum budget, because every cent that comes into this district for operations is contributed by your taxing units. District does not generate any funding other than, frankly, open meetings copies, fees for making copies for them, or turning over, giving document copies, or things of that nature. But every other cent comes from the taxing units. And the taxing units are allocated a certain amount of the budget based on their tax levy. So the bigger the tax unit, the more they contribute. So you may have usually it's the county or the city or the ISDs, which are the big boys and girls, and they're the ones that have the biggest share of the budget. Little ESDs or levy districts or irrigation districts have a tiny amount, but they all contribute. They're required, the way you do that is you start working your budget. You get input from the board of directors, you get input from the chief appraiser, what y'all's vision for the district is. What do you want to do? And then from there, you start directing, well, this is how we're gonna do it. We're going to fund this. The biggest budgetary item is your employees. Second biggest, I would say, is probably technology. Because it is amazing the amount and degree and speed of technology in its development as it's happened. There are artificial intelligence software that now read exemptions for you. They read the deeds and they figure out this doesn't work or this is missing, and they eliminate a lot of people having to look at the documents. Okay, owner one, owner two, do they live here? Do they live there? Is this their residence? There's software that does that nowadays. Overheads now, you have satellites, you have planes that fly over, you have oblique pictures, you just have infrareds. It's just an amazing, amazing world of technology. Your chief appraiser can probably bring you presentations that have much more detail. I just watch them because they're fun to watch, but these are the guys who implement them, and that is a tool that you budget for that will embody the vision you want to have for the appraisal district, especially a growing district like this. Then you develop your budget. You develop the key items. You develop how you're going to fund everything there, and then you send it to your taxing units. Taxing units have a certain amount of time to approve that. If it's not approved, it comes back. What next? You do it again. What if they disapprove it then? They will tell you why they're disapproving it. And you come back and you do it again until you get your budget approved. The most I've seen has been 4 times. 4 times. I don't know if you've ever gone to that. You guys are pretty smooth running. I don't read about you in the papers, but that's the critical function you do. It takes up the first 6 months of the year to set that budget with input from your staff, input from your chief appraiser, input from the taxing units to the chief appraiser, who may say, you know, we have all these exemptions here, or we have all these properties that you guys didn't pick up, or there's a problem over here. There's a technology to address that problem, but that technology is going to require a commitment of budgetary items from this board. You got to have a public hearing on that before it gets sent out to the taxing units. Next slide, please. Here's what you have to include. These two. This one's right here. That's the one you have to have a listing of each employee position with a salary and benefits. By position, whatever, RPA 1, 2, or 3, you have to have a salary or a salary range for that position. That is the one required thing in the code. And this is just some of the other stuff that we talked about what you need to include in your budget to presentation to the taxing units. Next slide. Litigation, my personal favorite, because I do a lot of that. I'm not sure how much litigation y'all do.
We do all of it.
Lucky. But this is, in some districts, it is a huge amount. Be aware that's the one thing that y'all really do not have any control over, because all it takes to file a lawsuit is a filing fee. In some districts, you get 5 lawsuits every decade. Other districts, you get 100 lawsuits filed in one day over an entire season. You might wind up with 1,500 lawsuits. And you have to, if you're one of those special ones, or you start getting the feeling that you might be, the reappraisal year and your values get extraordinarily high, be prepared for that. That is a big budget. What you need to consider is you got to fund it. You got to pay for the attorneys who handle that. in-house or otherwise. CAD, attorney's costs, expert witness costs if you go to trial, unless I have extraordinarily limited in funding, I always take an outside appraiser to go litigate a value question to trial. They are expensive, more expensive than attorneys. Be aware that if you go to trial and you lose, you might be responsible for the other side's attorney's fees and their costs. Yeah, that is, we're one of the few the public entities who are responsible for the other side's attorney's fees if we lose. And it's set by statute, they got some limitations, but they can still be hefty. Don't discuss the chief appraiser's lawsuit with the chief appraiser. And the exception, once again, you can talk about litigation in your open meetings or executive sessions. Next. And once again, what I talked about earlier, listen to your taxing units. They'll bring you the complaints. Might bring them to you, whoever you represent for the appointed members. Whoever appointed member might tell you, here's a specific problem we have. And that's something you feed back to the chief appraiser. And if you've got 30 days, if they disapprove of it, you got 30 days to come up with a new budget. So it's not a quick turnaround.
So it takes a majority of the taxing units to veto it?
Yes,
How do you define a majority? Is the hospital
number.
district? Oh, really?
the number.
So they're all equal?
The number. Yeah. It's a funny deal. It's the number, yeah. Next slide here. And these are just the don'ts. I mean, they're pretty straightforward. One thing here, if you do assessment and collection, you can't budget for that in your CAD operations. They're separate. Once again, the constitutional separation of appraisal and collection assessment. We talked about the financial audit. Haven't spoken about too much about how can you hold surplus money from one year to the next. You can, but you have to obligate it, and that's the phrase in the code. Must be obligated for a specific item in future years. And that's in 606J. So if you have, at the end of the year, if it's been a well-run and efficiently operated district for that year, and out of a $20 million budget, you've got an excess left of $3 million, you can send it all back to the taxing units or credit it against their future allocation. That'll make them happy. If you want to buy a new building, you can reserve it for that. If you want to start saving money for an upgrade to your camera system or your computer system, you can reserve it for that also. But it's got to be a specific, dedicated line item. Once it's in there, you can't use it for anything else. You can send it back to them at some point, but you can't, I'm going to rededicate this for something else. It's there. And ask your counsel for advice on that, but you can do that. A lot of districts do it to build up their funds for purchase of, basically, of a new building. Next slide. This is just how the taxing units share the budget is calculated. It's based on their levy amount. So, some exception that'll you'll see that when it comes up. Next slide. Your taxing units paid on a quarterly basis, and they're supposed to pay it on time. If they don't pay it on time, there's a penalty. What is it? 10%, 5% penalty, annual interest of 10%. It happens. It is within y'all's jurisdiction to waive the penalty and interest, and it is totally within your jurisdiction. I don't know if you have a policy for that. Most districts have a good cause policy, but I don't think you need to do that if you decide within your own authority to waive the collection of the penalty and interest. You can do that at an open meeting after a motion, debate, and vote on that request. And the tax unit has to request it. Next. Budget amendments. This is, budget amendments are kind of rare because they're really cumbersome. What if you come up short on something? We've got a major lawsuit and we've got to fund it. The refinery has sued us again, and it's going to cost $1 million to fund it for attorneys' fees and experts because they're not going away. You don't have it in your budget. You go through the amendment process. How successful is that? It depends.
Yeah.
Because what you have to do is you have to go, frankly, hat in hand to your taxing units. This happened beyond our control. We need to amend the budget, and we're asking you for more money. It depends. I mean, your big taxing units who might be able to absorb the hickey of a loss at trial of a major taxpayer, they may not want to fund it. What if it's what if it's a property that's located in a single jurisdiction? They might want to fund it, but nobody else may want to fund it. Therefore, your budget fails. So it's very difficult to an amendment process. Once again, consult with your counsel if you ever run into an amendment issue. One item that I've suggested to board members, and I'm not sure if y'all have it, and I'll be glad to share it with you, is called an interfund budget transfer. When you pass your budget, include language in there that allows this board, upon motion, debate, vote, to move amounts between line items. For example, if you got $2,000 in papers and pencils, and you realize you need $2,000 in red copy paper, and you don't have it, the inter-fund transfer item allows you to move the funds between those two budget items without going out for budget approval or going back to the tax units to amend the budget. It doesn't change your bottom line, but it's just a management tool, makes chief appraiser's life easier. They report that to the board, of course. So the board is aware of these budget transfers because it's y'all's budget. You set it, and he's administering it. And I'll send you one that I've used in the past. Next one. Common sense items. I've seen some of your agenda items. Y'all present financial reports on a regular basis. Of course, any board member can request specialized reports and work with the chief appraiser to respond accordingly. Your competitive bidding is included in here. You are subject to the same, as a district, to the same purchasing authority as a city. A city is not required to go out for a proposal and RFP unless the amount exceeds $50,000. That's the same thing here. So if you're purchasing a copier for $45,000 and they are that expensive, you don't have to go out for proposal. And there's other avenues to get that, but if it's under $50,000, you do not have to send out a proposal. If it's over $50,000, that needs to be submitted to a proposal. And that is usually there are some exceptions for that, such as professional services, appraisers, attorneys, engineers.
Single source?
Single source are separate. They've got to truly be single source. Architects, I think landscapers are also.
Landscape architects.
Yeah, landscape architects they're accepted because they're professional services. Though they're accepted, but everything else for services or goods has to be subject to a request for proposal. Single source items, it's got to be a truly single source item. If somebody says, I've got the best, I've got the only one that does 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And you come to find out, well, there's another one that does 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 and a half. That's not single source. It's really absolutely single source, that there's nobody else in the state of Texas, this universe, that provides that. Those are rare. And this, again, you can see a resident of a CAD, if you execute a contract, that's what was required to have been submitted to a proposal, any resident of the CAD can file an injunction, kill the contract. Besides the inconvenience of that, expect to have a lot of nice press about it. The handy-dandy press will have a field day with that. So if you have any doubt as to whether it should go out for proposal because you think it's professional or single source, consult with your attorneys on that. Next one. We talked about this. This is the depository. Just every 2 years, you gotta pick a bank and go through that one. It's probably not required, and segueing into this is not subject to an RFP because it's usually not gonna be over 50,000. It's a good idea to do it. If it's under $50,000 and you wanna go out for an RFP, there's no prohibition against doing that. It's actually a good practice. If it's kind of up in the higher range, you get some really, really good options and good responses on it. Next. And this is kind of they take the money the interest that y'all earn, and it's subject to the Public Funds Investment Act. You and some lucky board member or some lucky staff member gets to go to Austin to take the Public Funds Investment Training, right? And it's just a requirement because there's funds, you know how much fun it is. You have to go to take the required training because it is public funds and there's only certain things you can invest it in. I'm not sure what the amount is, but they're required to take that. Next one. Do we want to take a short minute break? I'm about halfway through here. I can probably wrap this up in another hour. Do you want to keep going? It's up to y'all.
Y'all's choice. Be good.
I have one more board meeting at noon with some decisions that have to be made that I have to be present for.
Okay. You're gonna be late. We're in
You got
training,
one
so I
minute.
think
You got 1 minute? No, I know, I was trying to hold out.
Yeah,
Busy, not for the same board meeting, so.
yeah. So,
Y'all's pleasure.
yeah, we'll just keep going. If you need a break, you can. We're not subject to quorum in this
No.
because it's training, is that correct, or?
I mean, I would like to keep a quorum,
Looks
but
like
this
we're
is
lost here at this
training and
point.
there aren't gonna be any actions taken by the board. There's no action items,
Mhm.
so I feel like we're okay. I'll just leave it at that.
Okay,
And we can just note the time that we lost quorum.
okay.
I'll go faster. Okay. 6, next. Reappraisal plan. Gotta do it every 2 years. Reason for that, you've got to get equal and uniform to comply with the Texas Constitution. Even number of years, got a posting for it. You have to hold a 10-day notice of taxing units and then to send a copy of the plans to the units and to the PTAD, Property Tax Assistance Division. That's basically the comptroller. And those appraisal plans, I think, are posted publicly, aren't they? Eventually, yeah. Next, the appraisal plan is, at the public hearing, you'll have people talk to you about it. You have to have that public hearing before it's adopted. But you have to make, obviously consider the complaints or the issues that people bring up to you by the public at the public hearing. The reappraisal plan I mentioned earlier is the work plan of the appraisal district and the chief appraiser. It is, kind of lays out how they're going to get to where they have to be by the end of the tax year. Next. And I'll address this also because we have had some media about the appraisal plans and what can be modified, what can be changed by board members in terms of preparing the appraisal plan or passing the appraisal plan. If you're not aware of Tarrant, Bear, Johnson up in North Texas, not Bear, Tarrant, up in North Texas and Central Texas, passed an appraisal, that reappraisal plan that initially attempted to place a cap on the value of increases on property. It was my opinion that they could not do that when they set an appraisal cap on the opinion of the appraised value. Can a board affect the appraisal of property by setting evidentiary standards they must consider? I think they can, because that's exactly what the Tarrant and Johnson board, Johnson's a little bit more liberal in terms of the scope of their evidentiary standards. But for example, Tarrant said before the value is raised, there must be clear and convincing evidence before the district to increase the value. It's already in the code, but this was specifically put in there, and clear and convincing evidence has got its own definition. legally, you know, it's beyond a smidge, and it's not God's word, but it's beyond a smidge, and it's a little bit, you've got to be able to have more tangible evidence there. I think they can do that. Can they come in and say, all commercial property will not be appraised? Potentially that creates problems, because if you don't appraise property, you're gonna have a problem with the state if they come in and run the test and you're below market value. Secondly, maybe a problem if you have your taxing units who are not receiving the tax dollars that they need to operate, because any limitation, a cap in value or reduction in value affects your collection rate and your taxes. Another way that can be managed is by the number of appraisals. You're required to reappraise your property every other year. Some districts are saying, no, we're only going to do it every 3 years. That's probably within the jurisdiction of the appraisal district board, but there's fallout from that potentially, because the market is so quickly developing now, especially down in this part of the coastal bend. Galveston is full. Everybody is moving. Lake Jackson, Surfside is full. If people want to have a little bit of the Gulf of America to look at, or the Nueces Bay or Capano Bay, they're coming here. And so y'all's market is understandably very hot. And if you don't have those reappraisals on a regular basis, there's a very good chance that you're going to lose some of the quickly developing value out there. We don't know what the legislature is going to do on that, because they were certainly aware of it. The author of Senate Bill 2, Senator Betancourt, was mightily upset about the instance that the Tarrant Board trying to limit this. I mean, I say mightily because I can't say the other word. He was very upset about it, claimed it to be unconstitutional, and just wreaked havoc. However, it has been quiet for now, although it's still an issue, and I believe that's because they tempered the approach to it, and instead of putting an absolute artificial cap on it, they've exercised their authority by addressing evidentiary standards that must be considered by the district in appraising property, and then also some of they've directly impacted some of the authority that they do have, such as when do we reappraise property. Consult with your counsel on the reappraisal plan. The key thing is it's all got to be transparent. Your taxpayers are deserving of nothing less, and your taxing units are deserving of nothing less. So whatever you decide on that, it must all be transparent. This is back to your appraisal services, and we're talking a bit about appraisal firms. The chief appraiser can contract with a private appraisal firm. Who is that? That's usually the appraisers who are very highly qualified, who are private appraisers who appraise things like the silica plant, things like the refinery, things like the docks, the machinery, or anything that's highly, highly complex. And there's a number of appraisal firms who do that. The chief appraiser is authorized to hire that firm to do the services. The properties are generally assigned to them, and it's a standalone contract. I'd urge that whoever is the firm, that you review their contracts on a individual basis, make sure they comply with the contracting requirements of the state of Texas. If you don't have a procedure for your contracts, you need to have one, not just for appraisal firms. All your contracts should be reviewed by counsel. There are certain things that are required now to be in code by the variety of Texas statutes. I can't think them off my mind, but they do have to do with anti-terrorism clauses, guns and ammunition, my favorite, oil and gas, my second favorite. They must be included in your contract regardless, generally speaking, of the amount. Next. Here's your, that's what we just talked about. And this is, if you have conflicts, you're required to file an affidavit before the vote and abstain from the vote. The conflicts are what we talked about earlier. If you have a conflict with somebody who's potentially a vendor of the board, you should abstain from that vote, and by abstain, I usually tell board members, leave the room, just don't stand there, just leave the room if you're going to abstain. That avoids the impropriety, or the appearance of impropriety. Here's where you have to be familiar with, you abstain from the vote if it involves real property or a business that the family member or the director has a substantial interest. It's defined very specifically. Substantial interest means if you own more than 10% or $15,000 in the business, or you have a real estate interest that's worth more than $2,500 in that business. And you have to file that disclosure if you're entering into a contract with someone that you have an employment or other business relationship getting more than $2,500, or a family member has employment or business relationship receiving more than $2,500. Those things I would just abstain from them. Doesn't sound like much, but it's still the appearance of impropriety, and it's also, it's a nice dent in the pokey. It's a Class A misdemeanor. It's 4 years. 4 years. Next slide. You're supposed to submit your conflicts, and it's kind of the same thing. It's a duplicate one. You can pass that one up. And another one, you can see you have a bunch of disclosures. The bottom line is, if you think you have a conflict of any kind, ask your counsel for advice. This is $100. That's potentially a conflict you have to disclose. Next. Again, if the vendor is a family member, this is what the conflict disclosure statement looks like. It's pretty straightforward. And once again, plain, straightforward, CAD can't have a contract between any business entity that a director has a substantial interest, as defined earlier. Taxing unit can't have a contract with board of director that has a substantial interest. And there's basically two substantial interests. Substantial interest is percentage, 10% or more, or a family relationship if the individual or your spouse is a partner, limited partner, or officer in the entity. Next. Common sense. Don't implement your disclosure requirements. Don't vote on anything when you have any thought of there being a disclosure of a conflict of interest. Next. Policies. This is where you exercise your general policies, and this is the vision statement. This is taking your vision statement for the district or a business and distilling it down to what become your policies. That's what we're talking about. They're good management tools, not only for yourself, but in particular for your chief appraiser. Here's the policies. He's got to figure out how he's going to get to them and report back to you. But the policies are there for his guidelines. Policy manuals are being updated across the state because of the changes in the law. They're about to get updated again after this session because we haven't finished. They're changing everything again. And once again, just header notes there. If you don't have policies there and something happens, chief appraiser is not functioning, or chief appraiser leaves, or there's a vacancy, or you can use, or the chief appraiser is not doing his function, those policies are there as a measure. You can use that as a measurement and management tool. Policies should be posted or easily on the website. Not required, but if anybody asks for your policy manual, they're absolutely entitled to it. It's a public document. Next. Some of these, you can see these are, again, these are required by the state law. Again, it's going back to transparency, time for public comment. I don't know how you do it. Some of it's informal in some places, but some people actually have a clock. Secretary or the board chairman is 3 minutes, thank you. If in that instance somebody wants to have additional time, it is either up to the chair, if that's in the policy, or motion and vote by the board to allow additional time. Usually it's kind of informal, and the chair usually has the authority to do that. Next. We talked about this earlier. I am sure you have the non-English access policies here. It should be more than just Spanish. It should be more than just Spanish because there's so many languages spoken in our state now. Next. Addressing complaints. You've got to have a complaint procedure. The complaint procedure we spoke about earlier should be detailed, but not too detailed. It should be general enough to set out the guidelines, but it also should make sure, allow a taxpayer to submit an affidavit, a complaint without having to jump through 100 million hoops. You need to have a pretty straightforward complaint procedure. You only handle complaints over which you have authority. If somebody comes in and complains about the value of the property, hear the complaint, but you don't have authority over it. My view is if somebody, member of the public, comes in and complains about it, I think they're entitled to have you hear it. But if you don't have authority over it, you can't make any ruling on it, and you can tell them that, either by way of a statement in writing to them or during the hearing. Once again, directors have no authority to intervene in decisions by the chief or the ARB on property appraisal, and no authority to intervene in decisions by the assessor collector on tax payments. Again, it's because those are separate functions. Y'all do not have authority over that. My view has always been if you have a property owner who comes in to complain about it, they've taken time out of their day, if for nothing else, listen to them and tell them, thank you, we don't have authority over that. You can refer it to the TLO who can follow up, but y'all cannot take any action on it. Next. Policy, this is your general policies. You should have who gets it. It depends where it comes from. Somebody may just hand it to you. It should be in writing. If nothing else, it should be in writing. How will you handle that? That's your internal policies. TLO should report at least quarterly to y'all. And if you get a quarterly report, no complaints, great. And what action can you take and how do you track the complaints? Because those are reported to the comptroller, who gives out the procedures. That might be, some chief appraisers or the boards delegate that function to their TLO. A little packet at the ARB hearings, hey, fill out this survey and if you're not happy, here's a complaint form. And they keep track. We handed out 500 complaint forms. In the month of July, we got back 30 complaints. Do the math, that sort of measurement device. Next. Again, policy. This district is policy driven. The written reappraisal plan, that's required by statute. I think I misstated earlier, your reappraisal is once every 3 years, not 2 as I said, but this is all required to be done. You must include these biennial reappraisal plans. If they're not done on time and they're not submitted to the comptroller, it's a fail. And that goes against the district on a MAPS review. Next. These are just general business management policies. What type of policy do you have with regard to inspecting data, schedules? I mean, it's public information. Anybody sends in a public information request, they can pretty much get most of the district's data in one form or another. Confidential data is subject to being redacted or not being produced, and an attorney general request being made. If you get a public information request or a specific request from a property owner handed to you, I would say thank you, and I would treat it just as a complaint, hand it to the chief appraiser. Consider it a complaint and just give it to the chief appraiser without comment. That way you're complying with the statute, written communication. Give it to the chief and he can follow up as necessary. And once again, these are just standard business practices. Check limitations. What can you contract up to? Some boards, decide that the chief appraiser can sign checks up to a certain limit. Credit cards, I don't know if you guys have credit cards or not. If you do, there's credit card policies, who has them, what they can use them for, and when they can use them for. Limitations as to purchase items, and reporting on that sort of stuff. And that's all set by policy. Next. And these are the don'ts. Don't establish a policy that replaces chief appraiser's authority. No meetings without properly posted. It's again, no action in the executive session, and those dreaded walking quorums. Those are, I'll come back to them, those are so easy to run afoul of. They really, really are. So just be aware of those. Now, for example, the hires and fires of district employees, stay away from the district employees, chief's job, not y'all's. If you interact with an employee and there's an evaluation of an administrative employee, and you've had particularly, a close relationship with that person, professionally and in their discharge of their duties, I think you're entitled to disclose that in an evaluation of the chief appraiser. With regard to anybody else, I don't think that's proper. Because you're the only guy you got hire and fire, chief and TLO, and your ARB members. Next, personnel policies. You employ and compensate personnel, and that's in your budget. That's what we talked about earlier. Every single position must be listed and identified by title and salary range. You can employ general counsel who serves at the will of the board, and then you can employ your TLO. Your general counsel is either in-house, outside counsel. Once again, they serve you, not an individual board member. The client, when I'm serving as a GC, general counsel for a district, the board is my client, not an individual, not the board chairman, not the vice chair, the body politic. The best interests of that district are my main function. My fiduciary obligation is to the board and the operation of the district, but they serve at the pleasure of the board. Next, I think we have talked about all of these. Yeah, you can move on. These are your operating procedures, and I think those should all be embodied. We keep hammering on these, should all be embodied in your policies. If there's a flow chart of work, that should reflect what these policies are. Next, map. This is the map. The comptroller's PTAD section reviews half the CADs every year. They review their policies and procedures, including the CAD board, and then they issue a report, and a lot of them are pass-fail. If you get enough fails, you fail the whole thing. That counts against the district. It also counts against the chief appraiser at a professional level for purposes of reporting to the TDLR, who keeps the database of all mapped reviews by RPAs. Next. Here's what happens if you flunk or have a fail in your map report. You got a year to fix it. If you don't fix it before the end of the 1 year, then the PTAD issues its final report, and then they get referred to TDLR. Nobody who has an RPA wants to hear the TDLR is on the phone for you. Nobody. And then they have, after the TDLR gets it, they have a year to implement those recommendations. If they don't recommend it or fix it, notice here, prior to this, you could pick up the phone and call up your map reviewer. Hey, look, I got this fixed. Here, take a look at this. I'm going to do this. Once it gets referred to that, you're referred to an investigator with the state. And you can't go back and talk to the guy who did the review. You're referred to the TDLR, and they are a lot less forgiving. That's why you don't want to hear the call from the TDLR. You can fall into, what is it? Yeah, they don't fix it within a year after they issue the final report. The CAD is reported to management, the PTAD, that's the comptroller, and then the property value study field operations. First time I've mentioned property value study. Property value study is actually, simple terms, it's a test a measurement device by the comptroller of how well the appraisal district is doing in setting market value. The district sets market value of all the property. They're supposed to be within a certain percentage of market value as determined by the state. And the state goes out, they have much more data and information, and if you've got to get within 95%, I believe. If you fail to get to that 95% as a CAD, you might get away with it for a year, get into a grace period, but what it does, if you fall out of the strata, the 95% strata, it's a direct impact on your tax collection ability, and it affects your taxing units because they do not get state aid. And that is a dramatic effect. So failing in getting a red flag on property value study as a result of maps is a bad thing, very bad thing. And here's the, right here, unresolved fail in the mandatory question jeopardizes the school district's ability to get a grace period. In other words, they get 1 year without having to be punished by having their state funding limited if they fail. The next study, the next slide.
I'll make a comment on that real quick.
Sure.
That's the reason why the PBS, I mean, not the PBS, but the appraisal, the reappraisal plan is so critical, and where the potential problem is with Tarrant trying to go to a 3-year versus every other year when you got property values that are moving so quickly.
Right.
We then jeopardize the school district's funding.
Yeah.
Because it is the fox guard in the hen house. The comptroller does, we have to be there, you know,
Well,
at those values, we're within 5%.
You're
So-
absolutely right.
And so when we fail those, then if you fail it a second time, then they lose that funding, and I know it's happening in a neighboring county, where their school districts are struggling greatly because they have, Orange Grove specifically, they failed the PBS on multiple occasions, and now they are losing funding as a result, so they're not even getting the full tax amount. They're getting the tax amount, but the state is cutting back their funding as a result of that difference in that map review.
If you recall, I alluded to the fact that the state has much more information than appraisal districts. When they conduct the property value study, they use a different database. They get more sales for a longer period of sales. And that way they, for example, you stop getting sales or using sales after, call it March, April?
We basically closed everything down in March.
Right. And
We
anyway,
had submitted a letter to the comptroller. If they would, instead of going in September, they would cut off in May, at least.
Yeah.
Because between May and September is what creates those sales, even though they timeline it,
right,
it still affects the funding for these schools.
right.
On the bad side. And talking about Tarrant County, right now out of 30, I think they got 30 some odd school districts, 7 of them already experiencing deficit
Yep.
issues because of the plan that they've got in place.
The reason we're talking about sales is because typically in the code, the date for valuation is January 1.
Correct.
So you can use sales for a certain amount of time beyond that relate back to January 1. For example, if a sale occurred in February, you can probably use it for January the 1st because it's close enough to it. The state goes as far as September. You stop in March. So they have a much bigger database of sales that they just relate back to the January 1 value date. And frankly, they don't care what an appraisal district has done in terms of their reappraisal plan because the state is still using their data that they have to set market value as of January 1 for purposes of testing the appraisal district. So if you limit the amount of reappraisals, I think that's what Amita was talking about, you limit the year, the repetition or instance of reappraisals, you're gonna miss some of those sales. So that's the issue that they're dealing with up in Tarrant. Because the state, frankly, and I haven't spoken to anybody, but I'm thinking they don't really care what Tarrant did for purposes of PBS. They're still using their data to prepare the property value study.
Right.
Next. If you have an invalid study, you have to do the walk of shame. You have to have a public meeting to discuss the findings of that invalid property value study. That's been around for a few years. And you have to give notice to your school districts, have a public hearing to discuss the receipt of notice of this. Some people say, well, all we have to say is we received it. Try that. Try that. When you've got a bad property value study and it's costing funding, it's a public hearing. Once again, I am very conservative on notice to the public and to the entities. You can't just say, okay, we got a bad property value study. You have to be transparent about it. Why? What happened? What are we gonna do to fix it? So you can try to just say we got notice, and I don't mean you, but a CAD can just try to do that. If you get a bad property value study, it's gonna be something that you need to be very transparent about. Once again, property owners are entitled to do that because it affects them. It affects the funding for their services, and it certainly affects the taxing units also. Next. These are just some examples here of the invalid finding. This is a letter that was sent by Comptroller Hagar about, hey, you got a bad result on your property value study. And this triggers the public hearing on notification of an invalid property value study. Next. Once again, you keep seeing this, it's a constant theme about reviewing individual properties or appraising properties. Here's, again, another reminder, your limitations on power to appraise, you don't have any. Power to review values on individual properties, you don't have any. Your action can be revoked by a majority of the taxing units by filing a resolution with the CAD board. But it only affects your less populous counties. If you recall earlier, I said section 6.10, the general disapproval statute has been eliminated for populous counties, in my opinion, because you now have county-wide elected officials, and you don't want to have their votes and actions set aside by taxing units. Next, we've spoken about agricultural appraisal board. Deleted this. You don't have that requirement anymore. You used to have a residency requirement for your advisory board members. We found out it's really hard to find somebody who wants to serve and have been in this business and in the county for 5 years. So that is now removed. And they serve two staggered terms of 2 years. When they meet, it's once a quarter or once a year, I think. But they interact routinely with the chief appraiser, and if there's a special ag use appraiser on staff, that's who they most interact with. Next. Once again, just assisting the chief with information. If you know of anybody who has these qualifications, feed them to the chief appraiser. And notice it is advise and consent. Kind of like the Senate, you advise and consent on the appointment of the ag use members. You will vote on them, but it's advise and consent the chief appraiser of the appointment of ag use advisory board members. Next. Yeah, so you cannot have an employee of the appraisal district be an ag use advisor, agriculture advisory board. Next. Your TLO, this is TLO, and their statutory authority used to be compressed into like maybe a paragraph. It is now, here we go. Here you go. These 2 pages. This is are the new responsibilities and duties of the taxpayer liaison officer. They have a lot more responsibilities, including reporting complaints to the comptroller, working more closely in the appointment and selection of ARB members. They handle surveys that are submitted to the comptroller. You have to turn in TLO reports to them. And once again, just no-nonsense things. Evaluate your TLO regularly. And I don't know if you require them to do their reports, but there should be regular reporting from your TLOs. And of course, y'all set the TLO's compensation in the budget. Next. Once again, you have this is the general statute for that. It's expanded to all counties. Some small counties have TLOs, even though they're not required to. All the large counties, which includes Nueces, are required to do that. You deliver the applications of the ARB, in this case, to y'all, but they cannot influence the selection of the ARB members. Once again, they will give you the data. If you want to assign them specific data points to look into as part of the evaluation, you can do that. But they can't influence you about this. They will do all the vetting as to residency, tax payments. Some boards do criminal background checks as part of this. Some do not. It's all up to the board. Next. Once again, same thing. And there's a TLO's deadline. They've got to send in the complaints to the board, to the comptroller. All complaints, suggestions, and anything that they receive from the taxpayer has to be compiled and sent to the comptroller before the end of the year. So they're often if not a full-time, but semi-full-time fixture at the appraisal districts, especially during the summer. Next. Once again, you can't select somebody from the district for being your TLO. You've got a personality driven, you got to get somebody there who's good with people. I mean, that's who they're dealing with. And you don't want to get somebody who works for the appraisal district, tax unit, or appraisers properties. The best advice I can give you, get a people person, get somebody who has experience in the appraisal district, maybe somebody who was a staff member years ago or who has taken an interest in this. You can do that as long as they are not employed with the CAD. They can be your TLO. A lot of TLOs I work with retired from the district after many years, laid out a year, came back and became the TLO. I mean, it sometimes is the ideal candidate because they've seen it from the other side and they can get down into the nuts and bolts of how to fix the issues. They're more of an ombudsman for the taxpayer than anything else. Next. And there we go. Welcome, welcome to all of y'all. I'm sorry it took a little bit longer to get this up and running. I am happy to answer any questions you may have, particular or general, and I will do my best to answer whatever you have in mind. Yes.
Is there any way you can touch on fiduciary duties, just briefly?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. There's always a question about who are board members. Fiduciary duty means you have an obligation to represent that person that is above and beyond your own interest. Like when I said fiduciary duty to the board and to the district last time, when I'm doing anything with regard to a client, my fiduciary duty is beyond my self-interest. If my client's interest comes first, if they ask me to do something to be somewhere, and I say, well, I don't really want to do that because, I want to sit home and watch the game that day, I'm not going to do that because my interest is to serve my client. And so I'm going to miss the game, as I did last week. And I'm going to go meet with my client and conduct and discharge whatever instructions they have given me. That's fiduciary duty. It's above my own interest. Question has arisen many times over my career. Who do these board members on these boards represent? Who is their fiduciary duty to? Is it to the taxing units who appoint them? Or is it now to the members of the public who elect them? My opinion is the fiduciary duty y'all have is to this district. To the smooth and ongoing operation of the appraisal district. As an ancillary to that, when you meet your duty to this district, you are in fact serving the obligations and meeting the obligations of the people who either elected you in the countywide election or the people who appointed you in the statutory method from the taxing units. You have to discharge your duty, in my opinion. The best interests of the district are what you must discharge. You must meet that duty first, rather than trying to meet the duties requested of a body of taxpayers. Because if you do that of a single group of taxpayers, and I don't mean it in a bad way, property owners or business owners, or this type of property alignment or specific taxing units, by so doing, you're going to be skirting your interests to represent the best interest of this district. You were appointed to make sure this operates well. And if you're meeting or trying to address specific concerns that are contrary to this district, and those rise up from property owners in particular, then you're not discharging your duty to this district. I mean, if you're doing the district best interest, it's going to flow to your taxing units, to your members of your public, to the members of the taxpayers, to the people who voted for you, to the people who didn't vote for you. So I think your fiduciary duty is to make sure the district operates as well as possible, that you budget correctly, that you ensure that you have solid leadership at the front, and that you have solid transition plans, and then solid responses to not any particular, any single member of the public or units, but all of them. So that's my long way around the bar. I think you have a fiduciary duty to to serve in the best interest of the district. Any other questions? That was I'm a long-winded one on that one. If nothing else, let me see. I think, yeah, we can go off the record. Thank you all very much.
Yeah.
Did you bring lunch?
All right, the time is 12:40, and I call this meeting adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. And here's the prize you get for sticking around.
Sandwiches.
I got a sandwich waiting for me at my office.
These are great. I use them on the back of my phone.
Got another meeting next Wednesday?
Yes,
It's good to meet you.
John Cook.
Show me what it's good to meet you.
Last name.
It's we get all these. We had some really nice ones for the TAAD.
thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's nice to meet you.
Yes, you too. Deanna, Evelyn, nice to meet you. I'll go to the restroom before I leave.
Yeah. Here, you get one just for making it work.
They get your card. Prize on my cold dead hands.
Give that to everybody.